So welcome today to this talk on managing misinformation and moral outrage on social media. I'm thrilled to have all of you here today and thrilled to have three amazing scientists with us. Lisa Fazio, Assistant Professor of Psychology and Human Development at Vanderbilt. Gordon Pennycook, Assistant Professor of Behavioral Science at the University of Regina. And William Brady, Postdoctoral Fellow at Yale. I am your moderator, Kurt Gray, and I direct the Center for the Science of Moral Understanding. And one of the center's missions is to conduct original research on bridging divides, such as our paper last month in PNAS about how experiences rather than facts better bridge moral disagreement. Another mission is to develop scholars, and we have an ongoing affiliates program that helps connect students with faculty and researchers more generally and develop their work. And so you can find out more about that at our website, moralunderstanding.com. Finally, we have a mission to connect science with society, which involves outreach on traditional and social media. And this talk series is part of that mission as well. And it's admittedly irregular, but hopefully becoming more regular as we go. Our last panel was with Jay Van Babel, Juliana Schroeder, and John Saruf on how to have more productive political conversations, especially over the holiday dinner table. And so if you missed that talk, you can view it on our website. It's in initiatives, events, and then there's a link to the video. Now, this talk will focus on the role of internet in social divides. And given that you're watching this talk on the internet, I'm assuming you're familiar at least a little bit with how the internet can shape our lives. There are some sites like Wikipedia where well-intentioned and altruistic people kind of collectively come together to discover the truth. These talks, I'm assuming, will not be about Wikipedia. They're instead about social media platforms where misinformation is common and moral outrage is frequent. And so our three speakers will offer their perspectives on misinformation and moral outrage on social media. And hopefully by the end of the hour, they promise me that they will solve everything wrong with Twitter and Facebook. Each talk will last 10 minutes, followed by a couple questions from the audience. And then to wrap it up, time allowing, I'll ask a few questions of the panelists as well. So if you have questions, you can just type them into the chat, and then I will ask those questions of the panelists just so they don't have to keep track. And then when the panelists are done their talk, they can dig into the chat if they have the enthusiasm to do so and answer your questions there. Are there any quick questions that you have before we roll, especially speakers? Anything I forgot to tell you about this? Okay, so without further ado, I'd like to hand it over to Lisa Fazio, who will be telling us about why misinformation is a problem.
Unmute myself. All right. So I'm going to be talking about why it's even a problem that we've got all this misinformation floating around. So we're all smart people. Why can't we just realize when something's false and then not believe it? So we're going to start with a short quiz. This is obviously easier to do in person than on Zoom, but here's what's going to happen. I'm going to ask you all to unmute yourself right now, just for like 30 seconds. I'm going to ask a question, and then you're just going to shout out the answer. So, audience participation time. In the biblical story, what was Jonah swallowed by?
Whale.
Noah.
Well done. Yes, I heard lots of shouts of whale. Good one. All right. How many animals of each kind did Moses take on the ark?
Two.
Noah's Ark.
Anything on the ark.
Noah's Ark.
All right, good. You guys can all mute yourselves again. You have perfectly illustrated the point I was trying to make. So that second question, I said, how many animals of each kind did Moses take on the ark? A lot of you initially replied with 2, despite knowing that it was Noah and not Moses who actually took the animals on the ark. So this is an example of what we've been calling knowledge neglect in the lab. So this is a situation where you have the knowledge in your head, but you fail to use it at the appropriate time. So you knew it was Noah, but you still responded to the question about Moses. We've studied this in a bunch of different ways. One of it, which is with these kind of Moses illusion type questions, where people answer the question even though there's a problem with it. Another way is through the use of fictional stories. So we have people read fictional stories in the lab that contain true and false information about the world. So you're reading a story about a summer job at a planetarium, and you hear, "Lucky me, I had to wear some huge old spacesuit. I don't know if I was supposed to be anyone in particular. Maybe I was supposed to be Neil Armstrong, the first man on the moon." So for some things in the story, you're reading the correct information, like this. Neil Armstrong, first man on the moon. Other times, you get the incorrect information. Maybe I was supposed to be John Glenn, first man on the moon. And then sometimes you just get neutral information. So maybe I was supposed to be the first man on the moon, no mention of a name. So just a mention of first man on the moon without the information. Way we typically set this up is we start with a warning. We tell people these stories are fictional, and authors of fiction often take liberties with certain facts or ideas in order to make the story flow better or be more entertaining. So some of the information you read may be incorrect. We warn them, they might see false things. They then read these stories that contain true and false information about the world, do a short filler task, and then take a general knowledge test. So basically a trivia test, bunch of questions, some of which refer back to the information in the story. So what we're really interested in is, how do people respond to questions like this? Who was the first person to set foot on the moon? First, we can look at how likely you are to get that answer correct. You're much more likely to answer that question correctly if you've just read the correct answer in the story, as compared to the neutral condition, where you just read about first man on the moon. And then if you read the wrong answer, you're now less likely to answer it correct. So you're less likely to correctly say Neil Armstrong if you've just read about John Glenn, than as compared to a baseline where you'd only read about first man on the moon. Perhaps more interestingly, not only are you less likely to answer it correctly, you're more likely to produce the wrong answer. So you're much more likely to produce John Glenn when you've just read it in the story as compared to when you haven't. So in this particular study, almost 40% of the time, when you read a wrong answer in the story, you then use that information on the later general knowledge test. In that study, people are clearly going with what's in the story rather than what should be in their head, but we didn't know exactly what they knew or didn't know beforehand. So in a follow-up study, we gave them a pretest 2 weeks earlier, so we knew exactly which facts they did or didn't know, and then looked at the effect of reading the stories on those facts. Here's just the questions that they got correct 2 weeks earlier, and you still see this big effect of misinformation. So 2 weeks earlier, you told me it was Neil Armstrong. Now you've read John Glenn in the story. 20% of the time, you're now going with John Glenn rather than the information that was in your head before. Even changes sometimes when you gave that initial answer with really high confidence. So this is just the highest confidence correct answers on that initial memory test. You're still sometimes switching to the incorrect information in the story rather than what you knew ahead of time. So this is another example of that knowledge neglect. You initially knew the correct answer, but now you're going with what you just read. One third example is going to be the effects of repetition on belief. So Franklin Roosevelt once said in a radio address that repetition does not transform a lie into truth. In many cases, he was actually wrong. So it is the case that repeating something doesn't change the ground truth. It doesn't make it true, but it can make people believe that it's true. So it can affect people's beliefs in what they're reading. So over 30 years of research suggests that when we're judging the truth of a statement, we rely on our prior knowledge, but also a bunch of other cues like repetition. In our research, we've shown that this happens again, even when you have relevant prior knowledge. So even amongst people who know that the Cyclops was the legendary one-eyed giant, when they read this statement, that the Minotaur is the legendary one-eyed giant in Greek mythology twice, they're more likely to think that it's true than if they've only read it once. So quickly, how we do these studies. We again have a knowledge check where we ask them a bunch of questions like, what's the name of the short pleated skirt worn by men in Scotland? They choose between the correct answer, kilt, an incorrect answer, sorry, or just an I don't know response. Then at least 2 weeks later, they're exposed to a bunch of these true and false statements. We ask how interested they are in each one. And then finally, in the truth phase, they're now rating how true they think each statement is. Half of those statements they earlier saw on the exposure phase, and half are new. So half repeated, half new. This is what you find. So each dot here is a participant. The diamonds are the means, error bars are standard deviations. On the left is known falsehoods. So these are things that you got the correct answer correct on the knowledge check 2 weeks earlier. You correctly said that it's a kilt that Scottish men wear. Now you're reading the falsehood about a sorry, and you're giving it a higher truth rating when it's been repeated versus when it's new. Also happens for the unknown statements on the right, things that you either answered incorrectly or with I don't know. But in both cases, just hearing it twice is making you believe it more, even when it contradicts your prior knowledge. Why do we do this? Our brains are amazing computational machines. Modern computers have a hard time perceiving and understanding visual scenes that we understand in milliseconds, but our brains are also pretty lazy. So people don't check everything they're reading against their prior knowledge. Instead, they rely on these more gut reactions of what feels true. And those reactions can be affected by a lot of different things, like how recently you've heard something or whether it's been repeated or not. I'll skip over that. How can we stop it and get people to actually use their prior knowledge? We've tried a bunch of things. We've tried giving people additional cognitive resources by making stories easier to read, or slowing down the presentation rate of the story, or even highlighting errors in red to kind of alert you that maybe you should pay attention to those errors and avoid them. None of that works. Some of it backfires and you just learn the incorrect information more. Having additional knowledge helps. So no one's fooled by a story that talks about Pluto being the largest planet, but knowledge doesn't solve things. Like I showed, you still have this knowledge neglect for things that you originally knew the correct answer for. What does seem to help is kind of slowing people down and getting them to think more about what they're reading. So actively trying to detect errors in the story, or actively explaining how they know that something is true or false. And that should segue nicely into Gord's talk. But yeah, happy to answer some quick questions.
All right, so one question coming from Andy is, these falsehoods are coming from a study run by academics, right, who you might apparently trust. And does the same thing happen if you a priori don't trust the source?
Yeah, it's a good question. We haven't done a study looking at kind of all of the repetitions coming from untrustworthy sources. Source manipulations, you get weird effects where sometimes people will pay attention to the source, but a lot of times they just don't care. So it's actually hard to get people to really pay attention to the source of the information they're getting it from. A lot of times they act exactly the same no matter what the source is, but it's definitely an interesting idea to test out more.
And maybe you've already answered this, but one question is whether you hear, if you hear the mistruth from the same or different source, right? If people are ignoring source, presumably it doesn't matter, but if your uncle tells you and then, your friend on the street, what do you think?
Yeah, so initial studies suggest that doesn't matter. So like if one repetition happens auditorily versus the second one you read it, or it's from different people, you seem to get the same effect.
Great. Okay. One question, then we'll get to Gord, whose hand is up, I see, but he can just kind of, I guess, riff on whatever he wants to riff on since he'll be speaking next. Laura asks, how do you determine the substitutes, Minotaur or Cyclops or someone else?
Yeah, so for most of these, for these studies, we've been using kind of plausible lures. So things that aren't wrong, but you might think could be correct. And it definitely does matter. So people who've done studies for the fiction paradigm where you use really implausible lures, and then you're better at resisting that. For the repetition effects, it doesn't seem to matter as much. So Gordon and I have some work showing that even for implausible statements, you still get these increases of repetition with belief, and those increases are similar size as for more plausible statements.
Interesting. Great. Okay. Thank you so much, Lisa. I'll turn it over to Gordon now, who's going to be talking about how people are lazy, and more than that too.
Thanks for not taking my question, by the way. I mean, it was going to be a great question. That's okay. It actually was like a study idea. We'll talk about it later, Lisa. You guys were missing out on that. Anyways, so I'm going to talk about our different sort of take on the problem of misinformation, at least based on a lot of the kind of narratives that have been sprinting around about this. So my subheading is how I learned to stop worrying and love the brain, partly because there's a kind of positive message that comes out of this work. So the key questions I'm interested in that I'm going to talk about are why people share misinformation on social media and why they believe falsehoods in the first place. And there's kind of two broad narratives that I don't have time to explain any kind of detail. The first relates to this idea that's furthered in the documentary. For example, the social dilemma on Netflix. And the basic idea is, I'll summarize the hypothesis as basically being, Facebook is melting our brains. That's the basic idea. Like that is, the algorithms are so powerful that they are controlling the way that we think. And therefore, like social media platforms, not just a conduit for misinformation, but there's something about them that's making it worse. That's like making us dumber in a certain sense. And we have some data that indicates that to some extent that's true, but not nearly in the same way that it's discussed in like, the popular consciousness about this topic. The other element relates to politics. That is the idea, the reason that false headlines, made up headlines like fake news content spreads on social media is because of politics per se, that it's partisan bias that's leading us to engage in this behavior. And so the hypothesis there is that it's politics that's melting our brains. Lots of things are melting our brains. And what I'm going to argue today is that, in fact, our brains are not melting. So, and that politics is not that big of a role, doesn't play that big of a role in terms of how people distinguish between true and false content. And Facebook has a role to play, but it's not melting our brains. Okay, so first things first, the rest is just now data. The reason that I am putting the idea forward that it's mostly lazy thinking and not politics is supported by examples like this. So in this study, we give people true and false news headlines. We have this cognitive reflection test, some way to assess whether people are relatively more intuitive, they score lower, or people that are more reflective. So that is, lazy thinking is just relying on your intuitions and gut feelings. And what we find consistently is that people who are better at reasoning are better able to distinguish between true and false news content, regardless of whether it's consistent or inconsistent with their ideology. In fact, we find that people are better at distinguishing between true and false content if it's consistent with their ideology. So the stuff that they're exposed to in their echo chambers, they're more accurate overall, probably because they have more kind of domain knowledge and all that kind of stuff. And so that what we find like across, and this is a very consistent finding, a bunch of different headlines, now 15,000 participants across all these different studies, we find the effect of reflection on overall accuracy is twice as high as the effect of partisanship, And depending on your theory, the effect of partisanship is probably opposite of what you might expect. Okay, and so what this indicates is that what is driving a lot of the kind of false beliefs out there in the world is not just like politics per se, but more fundamentally that people just aren't thinking that much about the stuff that they're engaging with, and this for reasons that Lisa's already talked about. Okay, I don't have a segue for the next experiment, so I'm just going to talk about it. So in this experiment, we have two conditions. All right, in the accuracy condition, they're asked. In this case, it's a binary choice. What I was talking about before is usually a continuous measure. It doesn't matter. But this is a false headline. So the migrant caravan was a big deal before the congressional election, and then like stopped being a big deal the day after the election. And so in this condition, we ask people if they believe the headlines. Okay, and there's in all the studies, we give them like a set of headlines. In this condition, we ask them instead whether they would consider sharing it online. So it's hypothetical, but they're in a different sort of mindset for that, right? And then we do the same thing for COVID headlines. Vitamin C does not protect against the coronavirus. And so there's a few things that we can learn from this. The first is that people are actually really good at distinguishing between the true and false news headlines. And this is very consistent across studies with different headlines, okay? You do find, of course, that people do believe the stuff that's consistent with their ideology more than stuff that's inconsistent, but the effect of truth is much, much, much higher, right? So if you wanted to like guess whether someone's going to like believe something, knowing whether it's true is going to give you more information than knowing whether it's consistent with their ideology, right? At least in this kind of context. However, when you ask them about sharing, you see a very, very different pattern, right? People are now barely distinguishing between the true and false news headlines, right? In fact, what you find is that people are sharing more false headlines that are consistent with their ideology than are believed in the accuracy condition, right? You see the same thing for COVID headlines. This is around the end of March, when you think it'd be the most kind of like glaringly obvious that you should only share true stuff. People are sharing more false stuff than is being that people would judge to be accurate in the other condition. And so what that means is that people are almost certainly sharing content that they could identify as being false if they thought about it, which implies that they're not thinking about it, right? And the irony about this is that people really do say that they care about accuracy. It's not that they're, and we have other data that support this I can talk about. They're not like, it's not a lot, there's some people are trolling, obviously, some people don't care, but a lot of people do care, they're just not really thinking about it, okay? And Billy's gonna talk about this sort of stuff, but in a certain sense, it's kind of obvious. Like social media platforms are social platforms. When you make a judgment about what you're sharing it with other people, and you're going to think about whether people are going to like it or how does it make you look and all that kind of stuff. And accuracy gets kind of pushed down, and people are kind of just distracted from thinking about it in a certain sense. The good news, this is why, I had the subtitle for the talk, is that this does not indicate an intractable problem. It doesn't mean that Facebook is melting our brains. It means it's just focusing our attention on other things. It's a unique kind of decision-making context. And if it's just a kind of distraction, inattention problem, then we should be able to put attention back onto accuracy, right? And so that's what we do in these experiments. So we have the control condition. People are making judgments about what they would share. We give them a set of headlines. These are both false headlines, obviously. And in the treatment, it's a fairly simple kind of intervention. All we do is ask them to rate the accuracy of a single headline at the start of the experiment, okay? Doesn't matter what it could be a true headline, it could be a false headline. This is a true one. It could be political, it could be politically neutral. Doesn't matter how they rate it. We only care that they're thinking about accuracy. And then when they move on to the full experiment where they're making judgments about what to share, they're more discerning in the content that they share. There's a larger gap between true and false. It's about twice the size. People are sharing, mostly in this case, they're sharing less false content once they're kind of put in a more of an accuracy mindset. They're more likely to think about accuracy, so they stop themselves from sharing the stuff that they shouldn't be sharing, given that they're thinking about accuracy. You see the same thing for the COVID content. Here, the gap is, again, about twice as large. In this case, it was more of an increase of sharing of true content. Other studies show it's more of a decrease often for false. Depends on the headlines you use, but the key finding is that we consistently across now like dozens of studies, at least a dozen studies, find this gap. After you get people to think about accuracy, they're more discerning in what they share. Now, you might be thinking, this is in these stylized kind of like online survey experiments. So that's like, whatever, maybe that's something unique to that. And so what we did in this experiment is we created these bots on Twitter. So they're explicitly labeled as bots. We even put the little robot image on the thing. There's no deception there, and they're nonpartisan. what we did is we followed people who tweeted content from Breitbart, which is like a far right partisan website. So it's not fake news. They're not like making things up, but they do. It's the sort of stuff that is biased and misleading. So if you're thinking more about accuracy, you should be sharing less of, right? And so we target the intervention at the people that are engaging in the behavior that we're trying to intervene on, right? And so some people follow you back when you follow them on Twitter. We screen out the body accounts. And what we did is we sent them a direct message, which is simply what we had done in the other experiment, but now on Twitter. And so we asked them about the accuracy of a headline, which of course is a super weird message to get from a cooking bot. And nobody responds to it, right? It's just, but we don't really care about that, right? We just want them to read the first line. We want the idea of accuracy to kind of be in their heads so that when they're engaging on the platform subsequently, we track them for 24 hours, they'll share higher quality news content. And lo and behold, that's what you find. I mean, at least based on the sources of content. There's like millions of tweets. We can't fact check everything, but we know that after we send them a message compared to people who have not got the message yet, there's higher quality news content is being shared, and the overall kind of level of discernment, the difference between high and low quality content increases, right? And the key, Breitbart is the key note here. These are people that we targeted because they were engaging with this content, right? And it's true even for people with lots of followers. So like that's a single DM asking about accuracy, and it's not going to work for everybody all the time, but it had a demonstrable effect in the aggregate. Okay, and there are several kind of advantages to this. The way that we typically treat misinformation online now is through mitigation. We try to fact check it and like try to make sure the losses aren't too great. We want to get the truth in front of people. The idea here is to get in front of it, change the way that people interact with social media subtly in ways that are consistent with their preferences, and that it can be scalable. You could just message people or ask them questions, or there's lots of different ways you can get people to think about accuracy that could be optimized, and you can change them. And if the social media company were to like actually adopt the strategy, they could, lots of things they could do. We're now testing it in like presently, like right now, the study's being run in all these different countries with the exact same content translated, obviously, at the same time to see if it works kind of elsewhere. Everything that I talked about was in the States. Yeah. So I'll offer some brief conclusions since I've already over the 10 minutes. So the more fundamental problem than partisan bias is people just not thinking that much, which is not it's not intended to be surprising. The same thing that we've been using to explain decision-making errors since the 70s is what explains this sort of problem today. Of course, partisan bias is partly driven by lazy thinking in the first place, right? And so this is a more kind of fundamental issue than just politics per se. Social media does seem to distract us from accuracy, but it's not like it's melting our brains, right? It's just a thing that's altering our decision-making in subtle ways, which in theory can be kind of changed back, which means, this is good news for educators and lovers of critical thinking. People who like the brain, it can do better than we think it does. And there's things that we can do to improve things. That's it. The end. Thank you for listening. I said I was going to go 30 seconds over. I went a minute and 30 seconds over, I think. My bad.
It's all right. We'll forgive you, Gord. Great talk. And it's a really interesting intervention. Some couple questions popped up. One from Tobiah is about whether the content matters. So whether the news is positive or negative, or people want to believe it, or good news, bad news. Does that matter?
For the nudge thing, yeah. I think I turned your mic off, Curtis. You're getting forever. You have to mute yourself, man. Yeah, there you go. So I don't know about positive or negative. We haven't looked at that. I know that it works for both Democrats, Republicans. It works for both politically consistent and inconsistent content. Of course, people don't want to share that much politically inconsistent stuff. So so it works for stuff that is targeted towards what they would want to share. And so that's the most important stuff in the first place, right? Works for partisan content, works for false content. So yeah, anything that you could imagine spending a little bit more time thinking about whether it's true compared to just not even considering it, it should have a kind of general effect overall, in the aggregate at least.
Great. And one more question, and then I think we'll hit up Billy, is the kind of root problem, you mentioned kind of social media platforms are about being social. Like, do you think that that's really what's driving it? Like people, when they try to engage with others, they're trying to fight partisans or be popular, or what do you think is going on there?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's a great question. We need lots of more stuff on this. I'm glad Billy's going next because he'll give us some answers to that. I mean, I think that there's a lot of different things that will be influential for different people, and that's part of the problem with trying to understand the motivations on social media, because they're going to be highly variable, right? I do know that most of those things are orthogonal to whether truth is number one, right? And so like any number of them could be distracting in any kind of context, depending on the content that you're dealing with, and so it depends. But Billy will have a better answer to that question than me.
Great, thanks so much, Gord. There's a bunch of questions kind of waiting for you in the chat if you're up for it. And
hey, can't wait to ignore them. Just joking.
Gord's too lazy to answer them. Billy, you ready to go?
Yep.
Awesome.
All right, I think we're good. Thanks, Kurt, for organizing this and everyone involved in the center, and for the other speakers. So I'm going to shift gears a little bit and talk about moral outrage in online social networks. 1 second. So there are billions of people active on social media, and I think it's really important to understand why there seems to be something exaggerated about the type of viral outrage that we consistently see. If you're active on the platforms, you've probably seen many episodes of outrage firestorms. And the viral outrage has consequences, of course, for growing polarization in the United States. And it's even spilled over into these offline situations with deadly consequences, like the Capitol riot that apparently was organized in social media forums with a lot of moralized and outraged language. So what are the factors that explain the amplification of moral outrage in online networks? Well, what I argue is that we need to consider the interaction of our psychology, things that we bring to the table when we're interacting with the platforms, but also the design of the platforms of the social media environment. So what do I mean by the design of the platforms and the social media environment? Well, online social networks are a unique social context in a way that departs from our historical social environment in many ways. So today I'll focus on two characteristics that we find can impact moral outrage expression by exploiting social learning mechanisms. And these are mechanisms that we all are born with. So first, social media employs, as we know, a social feedback delivery system. So when you get delivered likes and shares for posting content, and this facilitates our ability to learn from feedback by making that feedback highly salient and also quantifiable. So I call this streamlined delivery of social feedback. From this system, people might fine-tune their outrage expressions through reinforcement learning. And so that means altering expressive behaviors in response to positive or negative social feedback. Second, social norms of expression are also displayed to us in news feeds. And these news feeds prioritize arousing and often negative content because algorithms predict that this kind of content draws more engagement. So people might adjust their outrage expressions through norm learning, or in other words, matching their expressions to what they infer is normative among their peers when they're observing this news feed, right? So I'll talk about how we tested whether moral outrage expression in particular is impacted by these two factors. And we did this by looking at real social media data and also some follow-up behavioral experiments to confirm some of the findings. So I'll start by discussing these observational studies, and we collected the tweet histories of millions of users, and we wanted to examine how their outrage expression potentially varied as a function of social feedback. The first problem that you need to solve if you want to study moral outrage expression on social media is figuring out how you can measure it at scale in an accurate way. So we did this by using advances in natural language processing and machine learning. And broadly, what our model can do is learn the linguistic features associated with outrage expression and then make predictions about whether a tweet contains outrage. And I can talk more about this model in the Q&A if you're interested. But for this study, we first identified politically active and then another group of less politically active users based on whether they tweeted about politically contentious topics. And we collected their entire tweet histories And then we know also how much social feedback in each tweet received. And then we apply our outrage classifier and measure the outrage content in the tweets. And to test whether social reinforcement is associated with the variation in outrage expression, we set up a model that asks whether previous social feedback that people receive when they express outrage predicts people's current outrage expression. And in these models, we're controlling for important confounds like people's general tendency to express outrage over time, and also random effects of date. So there's variation in outrage on any given day based on what's going on in the world. And what we find in this first model are small but consistent linear effects of previous social feedback predicting current outrage expression. And I think these results are interesting because it suggests that outrage expression is associated with previous social feedback over and above variation in daily events and also individual tendencies to express outrage. We next tested whether outrage expression was associated with norm learning. And the way that we did this in the context of observational social media data was by measuring the ideological extremity of each user's social network. And we use this as a proxy for norms of outrage expression because previous work has shown if you're more extreme, you're more likely to express high arousal and negative emotions in the context of politics in particular. So we're able to do this based on a data collection effort where we're collecting all the friends and followers of users in our data set. And then we leverage an algorithm that tracks the political accounts that users follow. And in this way, we can estimate the mean ideological extremity of every user's social network. And so what we find is that both within and between data sets, the users who are in more ideologically extreme networks are expressing significantly more outrage. But the key is that we can show this pattern emerges even when you control for a user's own political ideology. And so this is kind of getting at these self-selection effects that could be driving this. And this is suggesting that users express outrage in ways that are conforming to the extremity of their network, even beyond their own ideology or preferences. And I think that's very provocative. It suggests this type of social conformity. And I think it's also interesting to note that we find consistently across both of our data sets that the more extreme a user's network was, actually the less previous social feedback was associated with outrage expression. So I'm showing you the social reinforcement effect size as a function of the ideological extremity. And you can see that it decreases pretty linearly as you get more extreme. And the way that we interpret this effect is that when norm information is very salient in the social network, you don't need to rely on social reinforcement to guide your expressive behaviors as much because you can just infer what is an appropriate expression from observation. So across studies 1 and 2, we're seeing evidence that both social reinforcement and norm learning are interacting to predict users' outrage expression over time. And these studies were, of course, observational, so a key limitation is that we can't infer causality here. And we also couldn't directly measure perception of norms because we were using that proxy of network level ideological extremity. So we designed a series of behavioral studies to overcome these limitations, and I'll talk about one of those today. And what we're doing is creating a simulated Twitter environment in an online browser, and that allows us to directly manipulate the social feedback people receive when they post, and also allows us to manipulate perception of norms by manipulating people's news feeds. So the way this worked is we have participants spend time viewing tweets in a news feed that come from a new ostensible social network that they're going to be thrown into. And we have them scroll through the news feeds that either contain a majority outrage or no outrage. And so we're manipulating the perceived outrage expression. And the tweets that appeared in these news feeds are actually tweets that are outrage classifier detected on Twitter. So we piped them right into the experiment. So these are ecologically valid stimuli. And after viewing the newsfeed, then participants completed a learning task in which they're instructed to choose to share one of 2 tweets on a trial in a way that maximizes their social feedback. And so the learning task was the same for both conditions. So we're manipulating the feedback such that on average, if a participant selects outraged tweets over time, they're going to end up getting more positive social feedback. And the likes that they received were drawn from a noisy distribution. So this is actually a pretty difficult task. And so what we find in the study is that both social reinforcement learning and norm learning can impact outrage expression. So I'm plotting here the percentage of participants who chose to share outrage tweets for each condition over trials. And the first pattern to note is that in both conditions, participants learn to increase their outrage expression over time based on the social feedback that they were receiving. And so this finding is replicating our social reinforcement finding that we found in our observational study. But it's also clear that on the first trial, participants had inferred different norms about expression simply from viewing this newsfeed in this one-shot participation. And in other words, participants were more likely to choose outrage on trial 1 if they viewed their outrage feed, and then they were more likely to choose a neutral tweet if they viewed the neutral feed. And we see huge effects here for this norm learning. But then importantly, we replicate this interaction effect where we find that norm learning is moderating reinforcement learning. So again, when norm learning is providing information that already helps you maximize the social value, participants are going to be less sensitive to social feedback on a trial by trial basis. And so this result is replicating these observational findings on Twitter, but we can now infer in this context that social feedback and norm learning both can cause changes in outrage expression. So in summary, we see evidence that past social reinforcement explains significant variance in people's outrage expression. And I think this is really interesting because it's some of the first empirical evidence that's documenting how this feedback delivery system of social media can play a role in shaping some of our online moral behaviors. But we also see evidence that norm learning is impacting outrage expression as well, and potentially moderating the extent to which people are affected by reward learning. So this suggests that people flexibly rely on different social learning mechanisms, and that depends on the context of their social network. And the last thing I'll mention that I think makes studying social learning on social media very unique is that both social reinforcement and the perception of norms in terms of viewing your newsfeed, these are both directly impacted by content algorithms of the platforms. So our newsfeed algorithm, if it feeds us more controversial content because it predicts we'll engage with it more, we might perceive that the norms of expression are more extreme or more outrageous, say, than they really are in terms of the actual base rate of our network. And this has important implications for polarization and how we think groups, the extent to which we think groups really dislike each other compared to how much they actually do. I think this is something really interesting to discuss a little bit more, and something that we're studying in some follow-up studies. So that's all I have. Thanks to everyone for listening. I'm happy to take some questions.
Great, thanks so much, Billy. One question from Ike Silver was about whether the kind of feedback process that you find with reinforcement is particularly specific to social media. I think you hit at this with norms a little bit, as you detailed later, or it's a more general process.
Yeah, well, it's certainly a more general social learning process, but one of the interesting things is the extent to which social media really amplifies the general process and the way that it delivers feedback to us. So we know that it delivers feedback to us in a very interesting variable interval way that is known to repeat behavior more often than other types of feedback delivery. And it's also, again, what I call more streamlined. So it makes this potential for social reinforcement amplified just because we're so aware of it. And in fact, a lot of us, we tend to make this calculation when we're posting stuff on social media. Many people have an intuitive understanding of what will get me more likes versus not based on, how things performed previously. And, we've all had the experience where we post something, it's getting no likes or shares, and maybe we might even delete it or something like that. So the answer is, I think it's definitely a difference in degree. Whether it's a difference in kind, that's an interesting question. That depends on how much you think the algorithms really play a role in a way that can, change the nature of reinforcement learning. I don't think we can speak to that in this study, but one of the interesting things is that the algorithms are kind of, again, creating this situation that I call technology mediated learning, where some of the social information we're learning from is not necessarily pure. It's what is overly represented because of what the algorithms think give us more engagement. So I think that's really interesting to consider.
Interesting. One question by Tristan is about whether it could work the other way. So people who are burned out by outrage and trying not to be outrageous, that, seeing that could result in opposing behavior.
Yeah, so if I understand so burned out by outrage, so one of the things that we've looked at is, do we see kind of curvilinear effects where people increase their outrage and then, you know, you eventually kind of hit a peak where you're starting to get too outrageous and then the effects dissipate a little bit. We actually don't see evidence of some people might call that a sort of a outrage fatigue or burnout effect. And when we look at our sample as a whole, we actually don't see any kind of significant decrease, at least linearly, in like say the second half of people's history, even though we see an increase in the beginning. And it's hard to actually interpret what that means. It's, you know, it's tempting to say, oh, well, this means people are just not getting burned out or like getting outrage fatigue. They're continually expressing it. But I think it's important to remember that in the context of social media, we're really studying outrage expression and not outrage feelings. And so you can actually be like very calm and sleepy and post an outrage tweet and no one's going to know the difference. So I think that's something to keep in mind. And it makes it kind of difficult to, you know, think about how can we study things like outrage fatigue or burnout by measuring language on social media. So I don't know if I understood the question, but that's the way I took it.
Yeah, I think the question, and there's another one that came after it, was about kind of like the norms of outrage might have people react against it. And so a related question, right? So that's more interpersonal rather than intrapersonal. And a related question is whether you can have norms that reinforce not only not being outraged, but maybe compassion, kindness, something like that.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think kind of similar to, you know, what Gord was saying, I think there is a positive side to this, which is to say, you know, social information and social proof does have power, and it can turn out that you can try to, you know, boost more positive language and more positive interactions. I think that's a possibility. But the problem, again, is that it's not just social information that we're learning from. It's social information controlled at least partially by algorithms. And so if algorithms are consistently pushing or overrepresenting negative content, which we, you know, my group and many other groups have seen, at least in terms of what is most likely to get shared and draw engagement on social media, then it's going to be hard to see how that's going to gain leverage, at least in the current setup that social media platforms have. But it is a really interesting idea. And the other thing I should mention is all of these effects, I think you have to take with a grain of salt, because every local social network has norms of expression. If you're on academic Twitter, you'll probably realize that, hey, you can be really nasty to people and it's fine, that's normative. But if you go to a different type of group, you might find that no one's gonna like you when you're expressing outrage or like using uncivil language, because that's just not something that happens in that small local group. So I think you just have to be aware of like the context. That's always important.
And that's a great point to set the stage for the question that I would like to pose to each of you, since you're all academics on social media. And that is, we'll start with Lisa. How has your research changed how you interact with social media? We learned that Billy already is nasty to people in academic Twitter, feeling licensed by the power of algorithms, which Gord mostly denies. But Lisa, maybe you can tell us about how you've changed your behavior.
I don't know if I have changed my behavior, because I got on Twitter after I was already doing this research, so I don't have a good control category there. One thing that I've been thinking about is ways that we can use repetition for good. So I talked in these studies about all the ways it's bad. You ignore your prior knowledge, you just rely on repetition to decide what's true. But you don't have to use that for evil. You can use it for good too, by just repeating the types of messages that you want people to take away from. So that's one thing that I've been advising communicators about, is to use repetition and these effects of perceptual fluency, not just to get people to learn false information, but also to boost what you want them to remember and know in the future.
Excellent. All right, I'll make sure I repeat things as much as I can on social media, especially to funders. Gord, how you become Mr. Accuracy, super accurate in everything you do now?
I don't know. I do. I think it's a good question. There have been cases actually where a particular event happened. I guess the good example was remember the kid with the mega hat in Washington, who was in front of the elder. I didn't jump on that one. And I think that was like my strongest individual test. I was outraged like everybody else. But I was like, this seems like a pretty short clip. I should just like see what's going on here. And I have to kind of attribute, I think that's maybe my work. I don't know if it is, maybe whatever, who knows what would happen. But yeah, I think I am more reflective on social media now. And then just like relating to Lisa's thing, like I do repeat myself a lot. So I think that's probably from Lisa's work too. So yeah, there you go.
Great, it's nice you're informing each other. Billy?
Yeah, to be honest, I think the biggest difference that I have implemented is getting on less and participating in less discussion on academic Twitter. But in all seriousness, yeah, I really try to be aware of like not contributing to that type of that language as much as possible, just because there are a lot of participants in these conversations, and unfortunately not all of them are represented in the conversations you see, and some people can be, especially like early career researchers, can be kind of scared off by that. So I think just trying to increase positive and constructive norms when we're having conversations. But yeah, I've definitely decreased my time on social media, which feels kind of like a catch-22, because you want to stay connected and you want to read everyone's work, but you also sometimes feel bad when you're on for too long. Yeah.
Billy, do you think about actual words that you know are in the corpus and then you don't use them because they're in the corpus?
Yeah, I don't think about specific words per se, but definitely the general tone. I think, I've moved away from thinking about this or that word, because that's so contextually dependent, but definitely like the specific types of emotion I'm expressing. And outrage is one that I used to be very active in animal rights activism on Twitter in like 2008. So I really know about online outrage. So you have to think about, what's your goal for communicating? Is it to persuade someone? Then you have to use a different type of language usually.
Great question, Gord. All right, so thanks very much. We'll end a little early just because I know everyone has things to do, but I'll save the chat so you can see the questions, Billy, and you can think about them and maybe write back if there's some folks you want to write back to over email. And other than that, I want to thank all the speakers for coming, and I'd like to thank all of you for showing up. And look for us in another panel in a couple months about another topic about moral understanding. So thanks so much, and we'll see you on social media. Hopefully not angry.
Thanks, Kurt.